Hi everyone, this video will be providing the Cantonese pronunciations and some information regarding the Japanese pronunciation of Genshin Impact character names. If you only want to hear the Cantonese pronunciation of names, skip to this timecode. So I've seen a lot of people noticing the Japanese pronunciations are quite different compared to the standard Chinese or Mandarin pronunciations. The main reason for this is that Japanese borrowed Chinese characters into its language several hundred years ago, specifically between the 5th and 8th centuries AD, which correspond to a period of Chinese linguistic history known as Middle Chinese. I'm not going to go into the specifics, but the differences between the Japanese and Chinese pronunciations are due to sound shifts since this Middle Chinese period. Mandarin Chinese, a standard Chinese, is particular among Chinese dialects, really Chinese languages, in that it doesn't preserve a number of consonants from Middle Chinese that are preserved in other quote-unquote dialects. As such, I want to provide the Cantonese pronunciations as a sort of reference and comparison, as Cantonese is another Chinese quote-unquote dialect descended from Middle Chinese, preserving different features including consonants not seen in modern standard Mandarin Chinese. Quick disclaimer before we begin. My Cantonese is not strictly modern-day Hong Kong Cantonese. It's sort of a weird mix between early 2000s Hong Kong drama and TV show Cantonese, as well as some ABC American-born Chinese Cantonese, and some Guangdong/Guangzhou Cantonese because that's where my parents are from. I'm actually not fluent in Cantonese. I'm a heritage Cantonese speaker, but I consider myself to have maintained at least the pronunciations fairly well. However, as a non-fluent speaker, I of course can't read that many characters. As such, the pronunciations I will be using are the dictionary pronunciations, specifically pulled from Wiktionary. I will also be variously pronouncing the Mandarin and Japanese pronunciations as well. I'm not a fluent speaker of either Mandarin or Japanese, but I have studied Mandarin in high school for 3 years, and I'm currently studying Japanese in college. I've also followed anime for a long time, so my pronunciation is decent. I wouldn't say it's terrible, but I wouldn't say it's amazing either. Now, the name of the region is Liyue. Liyue. This is one of those cases where the Japanese directly approximated the modern standard Mandarin pronunciation, the Japanese being Liyue, and then the Mandarin is Liyue. So that you won't hear much of a similarity in this one. So the next one is Beidou. Beidou. So this is one of the ones where you do see the similarity between the Japanese and the Cantonese pronunciation, the Japanese being Hokuto. If you split that by character, the first character is Hoku, and the second character is To. The reason why the Japanese has a ku at the end is because Middle Chinese had that K, which is preserved in Cantonese Bak. Now, the reason why Japanese has an H at the beginning of the first syllable instead of a P or a B like Cantonese and Mandarin is because Japanese specifically went through another sound change where all the P's in the language became H. After that, we have Chongyun. The Cantonese pronunciation is Chongwan. Chongwan. Now, obviously, in this case, both the Mandarin and the Japanese and the Cantonese are roughly similar, so there's not a huge amount to learn here. What is notable really is that the Mandarin and Cantonese NG sounds at the end of a syllable tend to be Japanese long vowels. So in this case, instead of cho ng, because obviously Japanese doesn't have an ng at the end of a syllable, it's just cho with a long o. So moving on, we have Keqing, which the Cantonese is hakseng, or alternatively hakseng. Which one it is, I'm not really sure myself. Again, the pronunciation I'm borrowing is the Wiktionary pronunciation, and it's listed on Wiktionary with both pronunciations for that first character. And the Japanese pronunciation is kokse, and again, we can see, similar with Beidou, Hokuto, that the Japanese first character, koku, has that K because Middle Chinese had that K, and we can see that in Cantonese, but the Mandarin, Keqing, does not have that, as that final consonant has been lost. And then the NG at the end of that second syllable, the qing in Mandarin and sing in Cantonese, we mentioned before, was borrowed as a long vowel in Japanese. So here it's se, long e sound. Moving on, we have Ningguang, which in Cantonese is Yinggong, or technically it's properly pronounced Yingguang. But you will also see a lot of people from, depending on the area, they will drop that middle W in the second character there. So instead of Yinggong, it's Yinggong, and then Japanese is Gyoko. The Mandarin pronunciation here is Ningguang. The Mandarin pronunciation and Japanese pronunciation here are also completely different from the Cantonese pronunciation for the first character. That one's harder to explain, not going to go into it, but just know that that's a different thing entirely. And then, as we said before, the NG final consonant is borrowed as a long vowel in Japanese. So you have Ningguang, Yinggong borrowed as Gyoko with a double long O. So long O for Gyo and long O for Ko. And then we have Qiqi, which in Cantonese is Tsat Tsat. This is one of those cases where the Japanese kind of just did their own thing, where the Japanese is Nana and the Mandarin is Qiqi. Not much to compare here. And then we have Xiangling, which in Cantonese is Hengling. Hengling. And in this case, Japanese decided to directly approximate the modern Mandarin pronunciation as Shanlin, so Mandarin Xiangling, instead of doing their Middle Chinese derived pronunciation, where you would expect the long vowel, so something along the lines of Koryo or Kyoryo. After that, we have Xingqiu. The Cantonese is Hangcao. The Mandarin is Xingqiu, and the Japanese is Yukuaki. In this case, the Japanese is not approximating anything. They're actually reading each individual character using the Japanese pronunciation that has the same meaning. So Hang Cao, Hang is movement, and then Cao is fall, autumn. And then Yukuaki, Yuku is a alternative historical form of Iku, which means to go, the verb, and then Aki is just fall/autumn. And then we have Xinyan, which in Cantonese is Sanyim, Sanyim, and in Mandarin it's Xinyan, and in Japanese it's Xingyan. In this case, there's not a huge amount to learn. It's roughly equivalent across Mandarin, Cantonese, and Japanese. And then we have Big Daddy Rock Guy himself, Zhongli, which in Cantonese is Zhonglei, Zhonglei. Now the Japanese is Sori, and then the Mandarin is Zhongli, Zhongli. In this case, aside for what we mentioned before, where the syllable final NG consonant becomes a long vowel, there's the Mandarin ZH, and the Cantonese Z initial was borrowed into Japanese as roughly an S or SH depending on the context. And then we have Ganyu, which in Cantonese is Gamyu, Gamyu. The Japanese is Kangwu, Kangwu, and then the Mandarin is Ganyu, Ganyu. I might be mispronouncing the Mandarin because Mandarin third tone is kind of weird in that it both falls and rises in the same syllable. It also has some weird sandhi patterns where it's pronounced differently depending on if it's at the end of a sentence or word or phrase, or if it's being followed by another third tone or stuff like that. Additionally, the Mandarin and Cantonese are written with a G, so Ganyu and Gumyu. They're not English G's. English G's are voiced because your vocal folds are vibrating. In both Mandarin and Cantonese, that G-like sound is actually a K without aspiration, K without the puff of air. And historically, Middle Chinese had this sound too. And when Japanese borrowed it, they borrowed it as a aspirated K, so regular K to most English speakers. So instead of Gangwu, it's just Kangwu because they don't have a voiceless, unaspirated K. It's just either aspirated K or G. And so Japanese borrowed it as an aspirated K. And then we have Xiao, which in Cantonese is Xiu, Xiu. In Japanese it's So, So. And then in Mandarin it's Xiao, Xiao. And then we have Hu Tao, which in Cantonese is Wu Tou, Wu Tou. The Japanese is Hu Tao, Hu Tao. And the Mandarin is Hu Tao, Hu Tao. In this case, the Japanese is approximating directly the modern Mandarin pronunciation rather than using the historically derived pronunciation, which would make it sound roughly like Godo, Gudo, or Koto. If it was using the historically derived pronunciation, though, it would actually sound less like Cantonese because the consonant in Middle Chinese underwent different sound changes depending on the dialect, so it's not exactly as comparable as other consonants. I will admit I am tempted to call Hu Tao hairdryer because if you kind of do pseudo half pronunciation Hu Tao, you get and then apply the ng sound rule the other way around, you get feng tong, which in Cantonese is hairdryer. It's not accurate in any sense, but it's kind of funny in my opinion. And then we can move on to Yaoyao, which in Cantonese is yu. The specific tone is the Cantonese fourth tone, which is actually kind of difficult to pronounce. It's kind of a low falling tone, so I may be pronouncing it slightly weirdly, but it should still be correct. The Japanese is yo, and then in the Mandarin is Yaoyao. In this case, it is a historically derived pronunciation, but they're all roughly equivalent anyway, so that's not a huge difference. And then the last upcoming character is Baizhu, which in Cantonese is baksot. The Japanese is byakujutsu. And the Mandarin is Baizhu. And then we can see that the Japanese has that K and T, well, TS, but T, because the Middle Chinese has that N, which we can see in the Cantonese, baksot, byaku, bak, it has the K at the end, and then the Japanese adds a vowel because you can't end syllables with consonants, and then jutsu is sot. Again, you can't end syllables with a consonant, so they have to add a U at the end, and then Japanese goes through another sound change. TU gets kind of the T gets turned into a TS-ish sound in that situation. When it's preceding the U vowel, T gets turned into a TS. That should be all the characters, but I might have missed one, so I might have to come back and do it. Aside for just the names, though, if you use the Japanese audio, you'll also hear a lot of the titles, which use Chinese characters. So, for example, if you listen to Gyoko introduce herself with the Japanese audio, it's Liyue se tenchen Gyoko. Liyue, as we mentioned, is using Mandarin pronunciation. Shise is referring to the 7 stars of the Big Dipper. 7 stars se is the Shichise, if I actually voice it properly, is the Japanese pronunciation of the character using the historically derived pronunciation. Tenchen is the Mandarin approximation, and then Gyoko, as you mentioned, is historically derived. If you read all of that in Cantonese, it's Lei Yu Cat Sing Tin Kun Ying Gong. So Lei Yu Cat Sing Tin Kun Ying Gong. And then Kokuse's title of Yuheng in the Japanese is Yuheng, which is an approximation of the modern Mandarin pronunciation. If it was historically derived, it would be something along the lines of Gokugyo or Gyokuko. The Mandarin is Yuheng, and the Cantonese is Yokhang. And then we have Rex Lapis's full title of Ganyu Teikun, if you use the Japanese audio, is pronounced in Cantonese as Ngamwang Daiguan. And in Mandarin, it's roughly Yan Wang Di Zun. And then there's also the Adepti, who have a bunch of weird long titles. So, for example, Moon Carver, Cloud Retainer, and Mountain Shaper. Moon Carver's Japanese title is Sakugetsu Chikuyo Shinkun, which in Cantonese is Sek Yu Zok Yung Zhanguan, which in Mandarin, I believe, might be pronouncing it wrong, is Xue Yue Zhu Yang Zhen Jun. Cloud Retainer is Ryun Sakufu Shinkun. In Cantonese, it's Lao Wan Zhe Feng Zhanguan, which is in Mandarin, Liu Yun Jie Feng Zhen Jun. And Mountain Shaper in Japanese is Li Sui Zhou Zan Shinkun, which in Cantonese is Lei Sui Dip San Zhanguan. That third character could also be pronounced as Dap, in which case it would be Lei Sui Dap San Zhanguan. And in Mandarin it's Li Shui Die Shan Zhen Jun.